Hunter Stan used an axe to split some fish in half. These were to feed his dogs. The bodies of the pikefish were slightly reddened. However, Tanana is not the spawning ground for these river fish, so the fish still had a substantial fat content. Half of the natives' winter food consists of fish. Cooking the fish until the meat separates from the bone is ideal. Each dog gets a full can of food. After feeding the dogs at the fishing camp, Stan prepares for the upcoming harsh winter. First, he must transport the summer's catch back to Tanana, a 60-kilometer journey downstream on the Yukon River. This year's catch was about 9,000 kilograms, roughly 1,200 fish. The transport still uses rafts, allowing him to also gather some firewood for heating. Eventually, Stan successfully returns to Tanana, which this year features a new road connecting Manly and Fairbanks, making it easier for outsiders to enter and hunt in Tanana's territory, significantly impacting the locals. Stan moved to Tanana 40 years ago because it was an isolated town. Despite his opposition to the road, he couldn't change it alone. That's the reality. Since he can't change the situation, he prepares for the imminent winter. Stan transfers the fish to his truck bed. Preparing food is just one aspect of surviving the winter. Securing water in advance is also crucial. He and a local youth, Albert, go to the town's water point. Albert, whose family's ATV is broken, rides with Stan. The spring, built by Stan 25 years ago, has been drying up recently. Tap water is a luxury for a third of Tanana's residents, who rely on the Yukon River for clean drinking water in the winter and the spring in the summer. As they fill a bucket, the spring's flow becomes erratic and then stops, a more frequent occurrence lately. After a while, it flows again. Stan has looked for the cause but hasn't found it. Returning home, he plans to find a new water source. He and Albert go to a nearby hillside. The area hasn't seen rain for 2 weeks. Moist ground indicates a spring. Stan brings a stethoscope, usually used for diagnosing engine noises, to locate underground water flow. The moss on the ground dampens sound, so it's best to probe deep. After some searching, they locate the spring. Stan lets Albert listen, and then instructs the young man to dig. Stan prepares materials, returning with some metal barrels. Albert digs a pit as water continuously emerges. The spring isn't large, but sufficient for the town. The brought metal prevents soil collapse. They also have a perforated plastic bottle as a filter. Now they need to channel the water to a bucket 200 meters away. The spring is near Stan's house, so he diverts it to a storage tank at his doorstep. To pump water without electricity, Stan uses the siphon principle. He retrieves a high-pressure pump head and a matched motor from his mini junkyard. They connect the devices with a belt. To initiate the siphon, they first pump water from the tank to the spring, then suddenly remove the hose. Due to the spring's higher elevation, the siphon effect occurs. After running the pump for a few minutes and disconnecting the hose, the flow starts slow but soon reaches full capacity, indicating successful backflow. Albert learns another lesson. This spring water emerging from the ground can be directly consumed. Although Stan has led the water to his doorstep, other residents can use it when needed, effectively providing a summer water supply. At the end of autumn, hunter Charlie looked for moose in the hunting grounds. He knocked on tree trunks with a moose's scapula to mimic the sound of antlers rubbing against trees. He also mimicked the call of a female moose, combining it with the male moose's call for a more realistic effect. Last year, Charlie and his son Bob caught a large moose by this lake. He hoped to be lucky again this year, but no moose appeared. With just 3 days left in the 20-day hunting season, it was puzzling since this wetland, abundant in food, should attract moose. The willows they eat, if old, secrete toxins. Last year's wildfire destroyed everything, but the new shoots were suitable for grazing animals. Over the past several days, Charlie saw no sign of moose, unlike previous years when he would find one within a few days or a week. This year was different, and he had to return to town to plan other hunting areas. Having lived in the town for over 20 years, Charlie witnessed the moose population drop from thousands to nearly none. Previously, they could spot several in any wetland, but now they might not find any even after traveling hundreds of kilometers. Then, James drove over. Since the road opened, people were everywhere. Charlie shared with him that he hadn't found a moose in over 10 days. With only the last 48 hours of the hunting season remaining, James came to invite Charlie to hunt together. If they couldn't get a moose during this season, They would have to hunt reindeer and bears. The two took a boat to Fish Lake, a traditional hunting ground in their town. Last year, Joey hunted a moose in this area. They imitated the male moose's call, which sometimes attracted other males looking to fight. Although they heard no responses, they found fresh footprints on the ground from the previous night, indicating a large male moose. The fresh tracks were reassuring, and they hoped to follow them to find the moose. The tracks became fresher as they moved forward, and eventually, they found the moose by the lake. Charlie and James immediately ran to a favorable shooting position on the shore. After pulling the trigger, they weren't sure if they hit it as the moose had fled into the woods. The adult male moose, weighing around 2,000 pounds, would be enough to sustain their families through the winter. They reached the woods where the moose had been, but found no fallen moose or blood. It was likely a miss. They found moose hair on nearby bushes and some broken branches, indicating its escape route. They followed in hopes of success in the last 2 days of the hunting season. By evening, they hadn't seen the moose again and decided to set up a temporary camp in a clearing, hoping to spot them feeding in the morning. They sat by the campfire, eating dried fish and chatting. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out from the woods. They looked towards the sound and saw faint lights not far away, followed by a campfire on the lakeshore. They guessed the others were not locals since the townspeople generally knew where everyone hunted. Approaching them might lead the outsiders to mistake them for a bear, typically resulting in shots fired into the darkness before checking the situation. The next morning, Charlie and James continued to track the stag, but found tire tracks on the ground. Likely left by the group from last night, they followed the tracks and discovered a distressing scene: litter and discarded deer heads and meat. No one was around, and only the necks and heads were left, picked clean by animals. This act of discarding heads for antlers was certainly not done by Tanana residents, who know well the value of food. Combining this with last night's gunfire, they deduced it was the work of those people, likely poachers hunting at night. They were dismayed by the scene. Hunting for sport and wasting meat that could feed a person for 2 weeks showed a disregard for the resources. The new road had made this possible, illustrating why some remote villages resist outsiders. 90 kilometers from Tanana by the Kuskokwim River, Chris and his wife spotted some grouse across the river. Unable to retrieve them if shot, they scared one into flying over to their side using a stick.
Stop.
Okay.
3, 2.
Oh, thank you, grouse.
Jesse quickly collected the bird, proving more useful than a hunting dog. Grouse were the easiest prey in these woods, but their numbers would decrease as the temperature dropped and they moved to higher elevations to winter. Chris and his wife live 90 kilometers southeast of Tanana by the Kuskokwim River. Their first year back involved unsuccessful moose and beaver hunts, and they barely survived winter by raiding a bear den. Nature had taught them the hard life. This year, they needed to store lots of meat for winter. Chris hoped to shoot a few more grouse, but Jesse had a bigger appetite, hoping for about 15. They continued searching the woods and found a beaver swimming in an inland water body. It was large. A small beaver provided as much meat as 15 grouse. This one could feed them for 2 weeks and provide rich fats for winter. As Chris was about to shoot, Jesse stopped him. Their small caliber shotgun might not kill the beaver instantly unless it hit the head, an unlikely shot given the small moving target. A wounded beaver would dive and escape to its den, and even if it died later, they wouldn't be able to retrieve it. They decided to spare it for now and come back with proper hunting tools. After searching, they found a bundle falling from a beam containing Jesse's frequently used bow. Chris assembled the disassembled bow body. Jesse was skilled in archery and had trained extensively. In haste, they had brought only the bow, not the arrows, so they needed to make their own. Chris cut some straight shrubs to arrow length and found an old bicycle frame in the yard to make a lathe for turning the shrubs into arrows. Only continuous rotation could ensure straight arrows. It is said that the world's first lathe was invented by the Egyptians 3,000 years ago, using a bowstring for repeated rotation to achieve this. Chris fetched a bicycle axle from inside the house. One end of the axle was fixed with a grooved pulley. Since they had no chain, they used a rope as the drive. After a simple setup, they had a makeshift lathe. First, they stripped the bark from the branches, then began turning them. Jesse powered it by hand cranking. For arrowheads, they used glass, shaped into triangles with pliers, then fixed to the shaped shafts with wire and feathers attached at the end. Aside from the slightly blunt arrowheads and thick shafts, there were no major issues. Hours later, the two brought their crafted arrows to the pond where they had spotted the beaver, finding a spot where it often came ashore. The tall grass around it made a natural hunting blind. To prevent the prey from escaping, Chris prepared a roll of thin rope, so even if a struck beaver retreated into the water, they could pull it out. They then began a long wait. Half an hour later, a small head emerged near the beaver's den and swam towards them. When it was close enough, Jesse shot an arrow, but unfortunately, it flew a bit high. The startled beaver quickly dived back into its den, and it was uncertain when it would reappear. With darkness approaching in 2 hours, Chris and his wife were not ready to give up. Catching beavers becomes more challenging in winter, and today might still offer a chance. After waiting longer, another beaver approached, possibly the same one, now more cautious and lingering without coming ashore. Jesse waited patiently, not shooting until the beaver landed. He then stood up and shot. The splashing struggle indicated a hit. Despite its resistance, the beaver couldn't escape being hunted. They immediately moved the prey to a clearing by the woods. The arrow had entered through the beaver's head. Despite Jesse's delicate appearance, she was a tough survivor in the wild. The beaver's wide, thick tail alone was enough for a good meal. They processed the prey on site, skinning it and removing the organs. Their home was very close to this beaver den, which housed up to 12 members, providing a sustainable source of meat. Afterward, they started back, aiming to stock more meat before winter. Meanwhile, 90 kilometers away in Tanana, Charlie was driving to the town's airport. His excitement indicated good news. His eldest daughter Tanisha was coming home for winter break with her boyfriend Curtis. The townspeople were preparing for the trapping season, and Charlie saw this as a chance to assess Curtis as a potential son-in-law. Upon arriving home, he started setting up traps. The trapping season in Alaska begins on November 1st, with the first 2 weeks being crucial. Some lucky hunters catch half of the season's mink pelts in these weeks. When Tanisha and Curtis appeared, Charlie immediately asked Curtis about his trapping knowledge. Curtis replied that his grandfather had taught him when he was a child. Pointing to a freshly sharpened axe, Charlie warned that he'd cut off his foot if he found him lying, a threat he had made to Tanisha's previous boyfriend. Seeing Curtis visibly shaken, Charlie couldn't help but laugh. Tanisha, worried her father might scare her boyfriend away, gave him a look to ease up. They then gathered their gear and a jar of homemade lure, heading out in their vehicle towards the trapping lines along the Yukon River. The trapping season hadn't officially started yet, but they needed to clear the path. Stones occasionally fell on the hillside, requiring cleanup for easier access. Each year, Charlie spent 2 to 3 days on this task, but this year, with free labor, it might be quicker. The road ahead was challenging, requiring the vehicle to switch to 4-wheel drive. At a frozen stream, Curtis, due to his inexperience, almost slid the car into the nearby Yukon River. Despite the sunny weather, the icy river water could cause hypothermia within minutes. A small mistake could be fatal, a stark reality of the Alaskan wilderness. After navigating this section, there were only 5 more kilometers to go. Charlie stopped again when a landslide blocked the road with fallen trees. Seizing the opportunity to test his prospective son-in-law, he instructed Curtis to clear the path with an axe. Although Curtis's driving skills were lacking, he handled the axe well, indicating frequent use. Once the road was cleared, they continued on. Soon, Charlie stopped by a small stream. Without saying a word, Curtis drove straight into it and predictably got stuck, soaking wet up to his knees. The icy cold compelled him to start a fire immediately upon reaching shore. However, Charlie insisted he pull the car out of the ditch first. Curtis had to re-enter the water to attach the tow rope, and only after being pulled out by another snow vehicle could he warm up and dry his clothes by the fire. Charlie had stopped earlier because he was unsure if the car could cross the stream. Curtis's rash decision to drive in was unexpected. After drying off, they had to detour through the woods to reach the first trap site. The area was littered with driftwood, a favorite spot for minks to scamper over fallen logs. The traps were set up high, but come winter, when the snow was a meter deep, they would be at the right height. Besides checking the traps to ensure they were sturdy for the trapping season, they noticed someone had dug a pit near one and taken the soil, likely prospectors taking samples. With the new road, their trapping and hunting grounds were crowded with people, changing everything for the local residents. A few days later, Charlie prepared the bait for trapping. He chopped a large frozen fish into small pieces. The cold weather had frozen the fish solid, hard as bricks. The chopped fish, fermented over the autumn, emitted a rotten, sour smell, highly effective for luring minks and other small animals. Any pieces that fell to the ground became food for the crows, which sometimes led the natives to prey. Charlie prepared dozens of baits, enough for a 20-kilometer-long trapping line. Today marked the start of the 5-month trapping season. However, snowfall was at a historical low for November, with only a thin layer on the ground, and temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Celsius. Unable to use snowmobiles, they had to rely on cars. During the autumn moose hunting season, Charlie had noticed outsiders encroaching on their traditional hunting grounds. Recently, he also discovered signs of prospectors along his trapping line. His fear of outsiders invading had become a reality. Charlie's trapping line was just across from the road's end, where outsiders would first arrive, causing him concern. This year, mink pelts had risen to $130 each. In a good year, capturing 100 minks during the season could yield an income of over $10,000. Upon arriving at the trapping line, Charlie noticed a promising sign: tracks of a mink chasing a snowshoe hare on the snow. Advancing, he found more mink tracks, which, to his dismay, were accompanied by human footprints. Judging by the prints, they were fresh from the morning. Not far away, he found another set of traps. Charlie's own traps were only 15 meters away. Clearly, his trapping line had been encroached upon. Local hunters follow a code of honor, respecting each other's territories, as taking someone's means of subsistence is akin to taking a life. On his way back, Charlie's suspicions were confirmed. He found remains of a campfire by the Yukon River, only a few kilometers from town. The leftover tin cans indicated these people came from afar. The road lay just across the river, a consequence of the recently built road. Minutes later, 2 vehicles departed from the opposite side. Now, he could understand why locals were wary of outsiders, sometimes even resorting to firing warning shots. Charlie wasn't one to cause trouble, nor would he resort to extreme measures, but he had to protect his livelihood. That evening, he sought help from Stan. Due to the scant snowfall, Stan couldn't reach his trapping line 60 kilometers away until there was enough snow. Charlie informed him that someone had set traps on his line, seeking his assistance. Although technically an outsider, Stan had lived in the town for over 40 years and was considered a local. The next day, they returned to where Charlie found the footprints and, surprisingly, discovered that the outsider's trap placed there had caught a mink. Without this trap, the mink would have been Charlie's. Alaska has no specific laws protecting trapping lines, but it is clearly illegal to take another person's catch. The outsider trapper knew the rules well. Every year at this time, minks descend from the mountains to the Yukon River to feed. Stan and Charlie planned to clear a new trapping line to intercept the minks coming down. There was already a path there, so they just needed to clear it a bit and set up the angled poles for trapping. The 2 experienced hunters worked together, quickly and with good spirits, and finished the path in one day. The next day, they checked their traps and found a mink in the first one. The inquisitive and seemingly wise little creature looked up at them. Charlie, finding it cute, decided to kill it quickly and humanely to preserve its fur, then continued checking the remaining traps. Most were empty, with only one more catch by day's end. Capturing only 2 minks was not profitable, but it was better than nothing. Charlie couldn't understand why outsiders would travel so far for such meager returns that wouldn't even cover their fuel costs, competing for scarce resources. He hoped their lack of success would discourage them from returning. While other town residents were busy with trapping, Courtney also took the opportunity to teach his daughter this traditional skill, ensuring she knew how to handle essential survival tools like axes and rifles. Recently, Courtney's mother had surgery due to recurring illness, leaving Moore to care for her in the hospital for the next month. With Moore away, household responsibilities fell to Courtney. In the town, everyone had their own trapping lines, essential to the Athabascan way of life, which relies on hunting, fishing, and trapping. Hunting and fishing were for food, trapping for clothing. Traditionally, natives started learning these skills at the age of 4. Now, they were starting much later. After tying the bait to a tree, they set up a trapping path around it, directing the prey towards the trap entrance where a trap is triggered. To demonstrate the danger of these traps, Courtney intentionally triggered one for her daughter to see, explaining that if it were a finger instead of a twig, it could break bones. They then camouflaged the trap with some tissues before moving on to the next location. Their family's trapping line spans 25 kilometers, with a trap set approximately every kilometer. The number of traps depends on the local mink population. They also set snares for catching snow hares, which are not very valuable for their fur, but are often caught for their meat, although their skins can be used for decorative purposes. Such paths are frequented by animals, making snares highly effective when placed there. For the second snare, Courtney let her daughter set it up, teaching her that the ideal height is just off the ground. Now, they would wait until tomorrow to check the results. The next day, Courtney and her daughter went to check the traps. At the first trap, they found a mink. Minks look cute but can hunt prey 3 times their size, including grouse, mice, and rabbits. As they approached, the mink became agitated. While some might use a stick to stun the prey, Courtney simply ended its life with a swift kick. Those not living in these conditions have no right to judge their actions as cruel. However, they teach their children to only take what is needed for survival, maintaining ecological balance. After thanking the prey, they packed it up. Next, they reached the wooded area where they had placed the snares and found a caught snow hare. The consecutive catches of mink and hare indicated good luck. Native belief often sees a connection between themselves and the land's wildlife. For the small animals, it might seem like a tragic fate. However, rejoicing over a catch can sometimes turn to sorrow. On the way back, Courtney drove a bit too fast and soon heard a loud burst from a tire. A tree branch she had run over likely caused the tire to burst. She was about 17 to 18 kilometers from town. If alone, Courtney might have chosen to walk back, but with her 7-year-old child, walking that far in the dark was not an option. They decided to spend the night in the nearby woods. First, they gathered spruce branches to build a windbreak, then collected dry branches to start a campfire. Fortunately, they had the snow hare for dinner. Courtney skinned the hare by cutting the fur around the limbs, and then pulling the skin off from top to bottom. After cleaning the innards, they roasted it over the fire. After eating, they crawled into their makeshift shelter to spend the night. The next morning, Courtney emerged from the pile of branches, and now they had to walk several kilometers home. This is standard procedure when a vehicle breaks down in the wilderness. Her husband came with another car early in the morning. He hadn't come the previous night because venturing out in the dark adds extra risk, and locals are experienced in surviving nights outdoors. The heaps of salmon on the ground at Moore's place are food for his dogs. Although other townspeople might think they have plenty of food, only Moore knows whether it's enough for his sled dogs, which consume 20 fish a day. With Tanana's winter lasting 7 to 8 months, these fish are clearly insufficient. Moore missed much fishing time caring for his wife, and with only a third of winter past, over half the salmon was already used. By the end of winter, he projected a month's shortfall in dog food. Thus, Moore thought of revisiting a proven plan from the past. Before the deep winter arrives each year, lampreys migrate to the Yukon River to spawn. Last time, they harvested hundreds of kilograms, and these lampreys have a fat content of up to 95%. Calling them the bacon of the river is no exaggeration. On most of their migration route, the wide river surface and thick ice layer of the Yukon River provide protection. Only villages 500 kilometers away have a chance to catch them. Today, Moore and James unusually decided to team up, a rare event since both families breed dogs and are competitors in the town. Due to the long distance and time constraints, they chose to fly to their destination. Flights from their town to other villages usually have no other passengers, effectively making it a chartered flight, which also means the tickets are quite expensive. For both, this trip was a gamble. If each could get a dozen or so barrels of lamprey, it would be worth it. Otherwise, they would lose significantly. After traveling 500 kilometers to another village, it was only reasonable to hire a couple of locals to guide them. The local knowledge about lamprey migration was crucial. After some small talk, they got down to business. Lampreys pass through a section of the river for only about 20 minutes. Miss it, and they have to wait until next year. The group drove snowmobiles to the Yukon River and started by cutting through the ice to measure the water depth. Lampreys typically travel in water depths of 1 to 2 meters along the riverbank, where the water flows gently, conserving their energy, and prefer smooth ice surfaces to minimize resistance. The water under the ice where they measured was 2 meters deep, ideal for catching lampreys. After establishing the fishing spot, an elder local decided to return home, leaving his nephew to assist Moore and James. Their next task was to cut a larger hole in the ice for fishing, but at that moment, Moore's chainsaw malfunctioned. The chain could freeze due to the ice, so they had to start a fire on site to thaw it. The migration of the lampreys could happen at any moment, and they hoped it would be delayed. After repairing the chainsaw, James increased the cutting speed to make up for lost time. Once the hole was ready, they waited for the lampreys to arrive, constantly monitoring the ice hole. As they waited, several snowmobiles approached from upstream, with people informing them that the lampreys had already passed and been caught upstream. It was unclear whether the delay was caused by the chainsaw issue or if they were simply too late, but they had missed the lampreys. At that moment, the young local guide mentioned another spot they could try. Quickly, they gathered their equipment and headed upstream. After traveling several more kilometers, they reached their destination, only to find a moose blocking their path exactly where they planned to fish. Ironically, during hunting season, they could not find such a large bull moose, and now it appeared when they weren't allowed to hunt it. Although they needed meat, it wasn't moose hunting season, so they couldn't shoot it. However, they could use a small caliber gun to scare it away. After the gunshot, the moose fled. They immediately started cutting and chiseling to prepare another ice hole. Once ready, James sent the young man to scout upstream. If people there were also waiting for lampreys, it meant they hadn't missed their chance yet. Half an hour later, the young man returned on his snowmobile, bringing back bad news. The eel population had already reached the upstream village, meaning they had missed the fish again. This was unacceptable to both men, but they had no choice but to accept it. Having spent so much money and effort, and yet getting nothing was hard to swallow. Despite their reluctance, they had no choice but to pack up and return home. They had lost their gamble